when a small-town judge fined Elvis Presley for indecent dancing. The young singer didn't argue. He showed up to court with his guitar. What happened next turned a silent courtroom into a scene of chaos, laughter, and history, and it proved why the world would never silence him again. August 18th, 1955. Tupelo, Mississippi. The sun beat down on the courthouse steps like a hammer. The air shimmered with heat, and every porch fan in town spun at full speed. Inside, word spread like wildfire. Elvis Presley had been summoned to court. He was only 20. Not yet the king, just a boy from Tupelo whose hips had gotten him in trouble. The charge written on the paper sounded absurd: public indecency. His crime? Moving his body to the rhythm of his own song. Outside, the courthouse lawn buzzed with gossip. Men in suspenders leaned on railings, fanning themselves with newspapers. Mothers whispered about that wild boy corrupting their daughters. And yet, in the back of the crowd, kids whispered something different. He's the future. Inside, the courtroom smelled of wood polish and dust. The ceiling fans clicked as they turned. Elvis sat quietly at the defense table, dressed in a simple black suit, his guitar case propped beside him. His mother, Gladys, waited on the bench behind him, hands clasped in her lap. The room fell silent when the door opened and Judge Thomas Kellum walked in. He was a tall, stern man with iron-grey hair and a stare that could silence a room faster than any gavel. "Mr. Presley," the judge began, "you've been accused of indecent movements during a public performance at the Tupelo Fairgrounds. How do you plead?" Elvis swallowed hard. His accent was soft but steady. "Not guilty, sir. I was just singing." The judge squinted. "Singing's one thing, son. Wiggling's another." Laughter rippled through the back rows. Elvis didn't look up. He just adjusted his cuff and said quietly, "Music makes folks move, Your Honor. I can't help that." Reporters scribbled every word. A flashbulb popped. The sound made Elvis flinch for a second, but he steadied himself. He'd faced screaming crowds before, but this was different. This was about something bigger than a song. The judge sighed, shaking his head. "This town has rules, Mr. Presley, and it seems your music doesn't fit them." The courtroom murmured. Elvis could feel the weight of their judgment pressing against him. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of people calling passion a problem. Gladys reached forward, resting her hand on his shoulder. He didn't turn, but he smiled faintly. She whispered, "You just be yourself, baby." The prosecutor listed witnesses. A local preacher claimed Elvis's dancing tempted the youth. A mother testified that her daughter fainted in sin. Each word felt like another stone thrown his way. Finally, when asked to speak, Elvis stood. "I didn't mean no disrespect," he said. "I just sang the way it felt inside." For a long moment, the judge said nothing. You could hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights. The crowd leaned forward, waiting. Then the gavel hit the desk. "Fine is $25, the judge said flatly. "Next time you perform in this county, keep your feet still, or I'll make sure they're still behind bars." A low murmur filled the courtroom. Reporters scribbled. Elvis nodded politely, then turned to pick up his guitar case. The handle felt heavier than usual. As he walked toward the exit, a young fan whispered, "Don't stop playing, Elvis." He smiled. "Don't worry, darling. Music don't quit." Outside, the air felt thicker than before. The crowd had grown larger, cameras flashing. Some jeered, some cheered. The boy from Tupelo stood on the courthouse steps, caught between laughter and legend. That day he paid the fine quietly, but something inside him refused to stay still. What would you have done if your voice, your movement, your joy was suddenly called illegal? He looked back once at the courthouse door, then at the guitar in his hand, and in that moment, an idea sparked, one that would soon turn that same courtroom upside down. The next morning, the Tupelo Times headline blazed across the front page. "Local singer fined for lewd movements." Copies sold out in an hour. Barbershops buzzed with debate. Radio hosts argued about that Presley boy. Some called him a disgrace. Others called him a spark. Elvis sat at the breakfast table in his small Memphis apartment, the paper folded in half beside a cold cup of coffee. His manager, Sam Phillips, slammed the article down. "They think this'll scare you," he said. "But they just made you famous." Elvis didn't smile. "Ain't about fame, Sam. They called my music indecent. That's like calling my heart dirty." Sam leaned back, rubbing his temples. "You want me to fight it?" Elvis shook his head slowly. "No, I'll go back myself. Settle it the right way." By noon, word spread that Elvis Presley was returning to the courthouse voluntarily. Outside, hundreds gathered. Teenagers holding makeshift posters, mothers clutching purses, men glaring from their trucks. Inside, the judge had already taken his seat. The same wooden bench, the same stern face. When Elvis entered, the noise swelled. Cameras flashed like lightning. The judge banged his gavel 3 times. "Order! Order in this court!" The reporter from the day before leaned forward with his pen ready. He whispered to a colleague, "He'll have to apologize. Watch." But Elvis didn't sit. He stood tall, holding his guitar by its neck, resting it against his leg. His voice carried clearly across the room. "Your Honor, I came back to pay what I owe, and to thank you." The room fell still. The judge blinked. "Thank me?" "Yes, sir," Elvis said, nodding politely. "You see, I thought about what you said, about not moving when I sing. I realized you're right. I can't move if I don't feel the music. So I brought the music here instead." A murmur rippled through the room. Sam, standing near the doorway, whispered under his breath, "Oh no, he's really gonna do it." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Presley, this is a court of law, not a stage." Elvis stepped closer. "Then maybe it's time the law heard a little heart, sir." It wasn't rebellion in his voice. It was sincerity. Calm. Steady. The same tone he used when singing to his mama late at night. For a moment, nobody breathed. The silence was so thick you could hear the clock ticking on the back wall. The judge frowned, but curiosity flickered in his eyes. Finally he sighed and said, "One song. Then you pay your fine and go." Elvis nodded once. "Yes, sir." He set his guitar on his knee, adjusted the strap, and strummed the opening chords of "That's All Right." The wooden floors seemed to hum beneath his boots. A few people smiled. Others frowned, but everyone listened. As he sang, the courtroom began to change. The tension softened. The gavel that once ruled over silence now rested idle. Even the judge's granddaughter, a shy girl sitting quietly in the front row, began tapping her foot. Elvis's voice filled the air like light through dusty windows. He wasn't singing to prove a point. He was singing because it was who he was. By the second verse, a few people were clapping softly. By the third, half the courtroom joined in. The deputy shouted for quiet, but his voice was lost in the rhythm. When the song ended, Elvis smiled faintly and said, "Guess that's all right." Now, a ripple of laughter swept through the room. Even the judge couldn't hide his smirk. No one realized it yet, but something historic had just begun. The fine was about to become a revolution. The last note of "That's All Right" still hung in the air when the crowd erupted. The courtroom, a place built for order and silence, was now alive with clapping, laughter, and shouts of "Encore." It wasn't the roar of a concert crowd. It was stranger, louder in spirit, but hushed in disbelief. You could almost hear the walls trying to remember if they'd ever felt this kind of sound before. The bailiff banged the side of his gavel against the wall, but even he couldn't keep from smiling. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling furiously. Cameras clicked. Flashbulbs popped like small fireworks. At the center of it all, Elvis sat perfectly still, his hands still resting on the strings. He wasn't grinning. He wasn't shocked. He looked peaceful. For him, it wasn't rebellion. It was relief. The judge tapped his gavel again, his voice raised. "Enough! Order in this court!" The crowd slowly quieted, though whispers still rippled through the benches. Elvis stood and set his guitar back in its case. "Thank you for listening, Your Honor," he said softly. "That song's the truth of who I am. I reckon that's all I can offer." The judge looked at him for a long time, his mouth tight, but his eyes uncertain. Then he said quietly, You broke every rule of this room, son. Elvis nodded. Didn't mean to break 'em, sir. Just meant to be honest. The silence that followed was heavy. The judge leaned back in his chair. You could almost see the conflict behind his eyes. The duty to the law fighting against something deeper. Admiration. Suddenly, a laugh rang out from the back of the courtroom. A young boy, probably no older than 10, stood on the bench clapping his hands. "Play another one," he yelled. The crowd erupted again, laughter spreading like wildfire. Even the judge's face cracked into a smile. For a split second, it felt like the whole town had forgotten its anger. All the gossip, all the scolding sermons. Everyone was just alive. Charlie Hodge, Elvis's close friend and road manager, watched from the doorway. He later said in an interview, "You could feel the shift. That courtroom turned into a church, and Elvis was preaching with a six-string." The judge lifted his gavel, but before he could speak, his granddaughter, that same quiet girl from the front row, tugged on his robe and whispered something. Nobody heard what she said, but whatever it was made him pause. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mr. Presley," he said, "this court was supposed to fine you, but I don't know how to punish a man for making people happy." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sam Phillips, standing by the wall, let out a low whistle. The judge continued, voice softer now. "You owe this court $25, but what you gave us just now, that's worth a whole lot more." The gavel hit once, not in condemnation, but in surrender. Elvis smiled, shook the judge's hand and whispered, "Thank you, sir. I'll make it right, not by changing, but by singing better." As he turned to leave, a fan in the hallway shouted, "You showed 'em, Elvis!" He didn't answer, just tipped his head and smiled. The guitar case swung lightly in his hand. Outside, the Mississippi heat wrapped around him again. Reporters trailed behind, shouting questions. Was that planned? "Are you trying to make a statement?" Elvis stopped, looked over his shoulder and said simply, "I just wanted them to hear the music before they judged it." It was the kind of sentence that would end up quoted in every paper in the South. That night, bootleg recordings of his courthouse performance began to circulate. Someone in the back row had smuggled in a small tape recorder, a reel barely 6 minutes long. The hiss, the echo, the crowd's laughter, all of it preserved. To this day, that tape is whispered about among collectors. Some say you can still hear the judge chuckle under his breath near the end. What would you have done if you were there? Shouted for silence, or joined the laughter? Because sometimes the loudest kind of respect isn't applause, it's surrender. And that morning in Tupelo, a courthouse surrendered to a song. By the next afternoon, the courthouse had become a legend. The same room that once punished movement was now famous for it. Reporters from Memphis, Jackson, and even Nashville showed up, hoping to find the man who'd turned a fine into a concert. But Elvis was gone. He'd already hit the road, driving down Highway 78 in his dusty pink Cadillac. Beside him sat Charlie Hodge, scribbling notes for the next set list. "You realize what you did back there?" Charlie said. Elvis chuckled. "Guess I made the law tap its foot," Charlie grinned. "No, E, you made 'em listen." Behind them, the radio crackled. A local DJ replayed the courthouse story like breaking news. Elvis Presley, fined for indecent dancing, turned the courtroom upside down yesterday when he performed right in front of the judge. Witnesses say even the court clerk was clapping. Elvis turned up the volume and laughed. "Ain't that something?" Back in Tupelo, things were getting wild. People gathered on the courthouse lawn, snapping photos, tracing the spot where he had stood. Someone even left flowers on the steps like it was sacred ground. The judge wasn't thrilled. "This isn't a tourist attraction," he told reporters. But even he couldn't stop smiling. That same evening, in the local diner, talk of Elvis filled every booth. A waitress named Loretta told a customer, "I was there, honey. The man didn't just sing. He freed the air." And she wasn't wrong. Because overnight, radio stations that had banned Elvis's songs quietly put them back on the playlist. Even the preachers who'd called his shows sinful started asking questions they couldn't quite answer. In just 24 hours, the laughter that mocked him had turned into applause. But not everyone was happy. A few county officials complained to the state board. "The boy embarrassed our legal system," one man said. "He should have been locked up." When that comment hit the newspapers, fans exploded with letters. Thousands poured in, to the radio, to the court, even to the governor's office. One from a woman in Biloxi read, "He didn't break the law, he broke the silence. About time someone did." Meanwhile, at a small cafe outside Memphis, Elvis sat with his coffee untouched. The laughter from the courthouse still echoed in his mind. The look on the judge's face, the way the crowd had forgotten who they were supposed to be for those few minutes. He leaned back and said quietly, "They thought they were fining me for moving, but maybe I was just showing them what it means to be alive." Charlie nodded slowly. "So what now?" Elvis looked down at his guitar case. "Now," he said, "we keep playing till nobody's scared to dance again." A pause. The jukebox clicked. Mystery Train started playing softly in the background, his own voice chasing him down the highway of his own legend. Outside, the wind picked up dust from the road, spinning it through the sunset like sparks. Somewhere in that orange glow, you could feel it. The start of something that couldn't be fined, stopped, or silenced anymore. Because the story had already escaped Tupelo. It was on every radio, whispered in every diner, and humming in every heart that refused to sit still. What would you have done? Stayed quiet in your seat, or stood up and clapped? Elvis didn't know it yet, but that roar from inside a Mississippi courtroom was just the beginning. The next sound the world would hear wouldn't be applause, it would be thunder. 2 days later, in a quiet Memphis motel off Highway 51, Elvis woke to the sound of someone knocking at his door. Charlie opened it. A postal clerk stood there holding a brown envelope, sealed with a wax crest from the Tupelo County Courthouse. "For Mr. Presley," the clerk said. "Delivered by hand," Elvis frowned. "From the judge?" Charlie nodded, setting it on the table. Only one way to find out. The paper inside smelled faintly of ink and tobacco. At the top, embossed in gold letters, it read, "Office of Judge Thomas Kellum." Elvis unfolded it carefully. His eyes scanned the words, his lips moving silently as he read, "Mr. Presley, after much thought, I have decided to dismiss your fine. I called your performance indecent, but it seems I mistook freedom for chaos. My granddaughter has not stopped humming that tune since you left. I may not understand your kind of music, but I do understand truth when I hear it. Keep playing." "T. Kellum." Elvis let out a quiet laugh. "Well, I'll be—" Charlie grinned. "Guess you turned a judge into a fan." Elvis set the letter down on the nightstand. "No, Charlie," he said softly. "I just reminded him what feeling alive sounds like." He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the ceiling, lost in thought. For the first time, it wasn't about anger or proving himself. It was about connection, that invisible thread between his voice and their hearts. Out the window, the afternoon light fell golden across the parking lot. A few fans had already gathered by the road, holding hand-painted signs. "We believe Elvis!" He walked outside barefoot, still holding the letter. The crowd went quiet. A young girl, maybe 12, handed him a small white flower. "Mama said you changed that judge's heart," she said shyly. Elvis smiled and knelt. "Sweetheart," he said, "the heart changes itself. I just sang loud enough for it to hear." Flashbulbs popped as he stood. A fan shouted, "What are you going to do next, Elvis?" He thought for a moment, then said, "Play louder, for everybody who's ever been told to sit still." Back in Tupelo, the letter story spread faster than wildfire. Newspapers ran a new headline, "Judge overturns fine, calls Presley's music truth." Radio stations replayed the clip from the courtroom performance until the tape hissed from wear. Churches preached sermons about the power of forgiveness. Even the same sheriff who'd written the citation admitted, "Didn't expect that boy to handle it like a gentleman." And that was the twist. Elvis hadn't rebelled with fists or fury. He'd disarmed a courtroom with grace. What would you have done if you had the power to turn humiliation into harmony? The answer was already echoing through jukeboxes across the South. Every diner, every dance hall, every small-town station spinning That's All Right Now carried a hidden message. Music doesn't beg for permission. It proves it belongs. That evening, Elvis slipped the letter into his guitar case, between a gospel lyric sheet and a folded photograph of his mother. He tapped the case shut and smiled. "Guess that's the best encore I'll ever get," he said. Then he grabbed his jacket, turned off the light and walked out into the Memphis night. He didn't know it yet, but that letter, written in ink and humility, was about to change more than just one man's reputation. It would change the way America heard its own heartbeat. By the time the sun rose over Tupelo a week later, the courthouse steps looked more like a festival than a government building. Teenagers leaned against the railings, guitars slung over their backs. Families came from neighboring towns just to stand where it all happened, the day Elvis turned judgment into joy. Someone had spray-painted on the sidewalk in chalk, "Here." Music stood trial and won. Reporters arrived early, hoping to get another quote from Judge Kellum, but the old man wasn't giving interviews. He sat inside his office, looking out the window at the growing crowd. The sound of laughter and strumming guitars drifted through the glass. He called his secretary. "Miss Allen, do you hear that?" "Yes, sir," she said, smiling. "It's beautiful." The judge didn't answer. He just nodded quietly, the same way a man does when he realizes the world has outgrown him, but in the best way. That afternoon, local radio hosted a live broadcast from the courthouse lawn. The DJ announced, "We're standing right here where Elvis Presley sang the song that made the law tap its feet. Folks, this is history in the making." You could hear cheers in the background, harmonicas, even a group of kids singing off-key versions of That's All Right. Meanwhile, miles away in Nashville, music producers took notice. If a small-town courtroom could explode with sound, imagine what would happen on a national stage. Within days, Elvis was booked solid. State fairs, theaters, even a rumored TV appearance. The fine that once threatened to quiet him had become his amplifier. Charlie Hodge sat beside him on the tour bus that night, watching the city lights fade. "You know, he said, "I think you just made the law dance." Elvis chuckled. "Nah, Charlie, the law just remembered it had feet." Outside the bus window, small towns rolled past. Neon diners, dusty roads, kids waving from porches. Every one of them humming his song. Back in Tupelo, the courthouse had become a landmark overnight. Tourists asked to take photos inside the same room where the gavel had dropped. A plaque was nailed beside the door a year later. It read, "In this courtroom, August 1955, a young man sang, and the world listened differently ever after. Visitors still touch it before leaving. Some even leave ticket stubs, guitar picks, or handwritten notes." A local newspaper described the transformation perfectly. A judge tried to silence a rhythm, and instead gave it a stage. Elvis kept that clipping tucked in his jacket pocket. Sometimes before a show, he'd read it to himself and grin. "I guess even the law needs a little soul," he'd say, and maybe that's what made him different. He didn't fight hatred with fire, he turned it into harmony. What would you have done if your biggest critic suddenly became part of your song? Because that's exactly what happened in Tupelo. A courtroom, a judge, a gavel, all of them now part of the legend they tried to stop. By the end of that summer, radio stations across America were calling it the day the law learned to dance. And for Elvis, it was the day he realized something even deeper. Music doesn't just move people, it transforms them. Years passed, but that little courtroom in Tupelo never faded from memory. Tour buses still stopped on Main Street. Fans leaned over the courthouse steps, whispering like pilgrims at a holy site. The same wooden bench where Elvis once sat had been polished by decades of hands. Some said you could still feel the vibration of the song in its grain. Inside, a framed copy of Judge Kellum's handwritten letter hung beside the gavel he once used. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "He came to pay a fine. He left us freedom." Every visitor stopped to read it. Some smiled, others teared up. One old man said, "I was there that day, and when he sang, it felt like every wall in this place turned to air." Elvis himself rarely talked about it, but when someone asked during an interview years later, he smiled and said, "That fine was the best investment I ever made." He never changed who he was, not his accent, not his swagger, not his soul, because that day in 1955 taught him something more powerful than fame. When people try to tame what makes you different, you don't fight them. You show them why it matters. And that's what he did for the rest of his life. On every stage, in every song, he carried a piece of that courtroom with him. A reminder that truth doesn't need permission to move. So next time you hear his voice through static and hiss, think of that day in Tupelo, a gavel, a song, and a boy who taught a whole world to move without fear. If this story made you feel something, share it with someone who's ever been told to tone themselves down, because courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sings softly in a courtroom until even the judge starts to smile. Elvis didn't just pay a fine that day. He paid the price for freedom and made the whole world dance.